Joining me now is Hannah Weisfeld. If you watch this program, we've had her on before. Very positive reaction to her because she is indeed brilliant, if I say so myself. Executive Director and founder of Yachad, and she joins me now. Let me ask you, London, a no-go zone for Jews. I mean, that's what all the headlines say. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting kind of what you just said, which is that, you know, politicians need to pit us against each other. And I think what's happened and is happening kind of in the last 48 hours with the Israel-Palestine conflict is that we've seen this kind of explosion of how much can we export this conflict, import it onto the streets of London and actually pit communities against each other in a way which is really problematic and is making what is a very tense atmosphere here even worse. So, look, it's absolutely the case that there has been a significant and very sharp increase in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia since October the 7th. But we're now in a space where we're basically saying anybody who comes out on the streets to protest for a ceasefire is an extremist who is saying, you know, that Jews are not welcome in Britain, and anybody who's Jewish needs to stay at home because there are these people on the streets that are making sure that it's not safe for you to walk around. It's obviously much more complex than that. And there are pockets of those demonstrations where people hold placards and say things which are problematic, that I find problematic. And there are hundreds of thousands of people on the streets calling for a ceasefire, which you can agree or disagree with that call, but that's an absolutely legitimate democratic right that people have to protest. What I think is the responsibility of politicians is to actually dial down the rhetoric and say, how do we protect Jews in an environment which is quite tense and fraught, and protect the rights of people to democratically protest, and not suggest that those two things are a zero-sum game, which is basically where we are today.
One of the things as well that disturbs me is this need to paint things in black and white. For instance, you know, I keep saying you can be, for instance, anti-Hamas, but pro-Palestinian people. You can be anti-Netanyahu, but be pro-Jewish. People seem to think that a block of people only think this or only think that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And actually, this conflict has almost become this kind of very simplistic, you know, I think social media has a lot to answer for in that regard, but this very simplistic thing which says you decide which side you are on. And once you have picked that side, you are basically against the other side, which sounds kind of almost childish, but I think that is really what is happening. So that there is this sense that if you go out and you protest for a ceasefire, you support Hamas repeating the actions of October the 7th. And if you think that Israel has a right to defend itself, you support the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinian children. Both of those things are false equations, and there are people that think both those things, at extreme ends. But actually, there are large numbers of people in the middle, and polling of the UK public shows that the overwhelming majority of people actually just...
Oh, I think she just frozen there. Sorry, so we just missed what you said there.
Lovely. Oh, I just was saying that the polling of the British public shows that the overwhelming majority of the British public believe that this conflict is very bad for all the people involved and would like to see an end to it. And actually they don't take hardline positions in either direction. But the way in which it's portrayed in the media, the mainstream media and within social media, is that there is extremists at either end of this, and that they control the discourse and the narrative. And actually, it's incumbent upon everyone to elevate the voices of moderates who are looking for a way out of the conflict.
And one rabbi pointed out that there are many Israelis, there are many Jewish people in this march as well. So, I mean, I wish the nuances, as you were saying, the nuances aren't being brought into the discourse.
Yeah, look, there is a Jewish bloc at those demonstrations, and there are Jews that protest. I would say that it's not a huge number of people. It's not an insignificant number of people, and there are people, and I don't want to diminish the fact that there are people that feel quite threatened by them. But actually, fundamentally, the call for a ceasefire is not an anti-Jewish call. I think it plays out as a, and we have seen pockets of protest where people are supporting the actions of Hamas as legitimate resistance, and that is very offensive.
Oh, she's frozen again. But
essentially committing a terrorist attack.
yeah, sorry, Hannah, we just lost the end of that. You were saying, yeah, people supporting Hamas, or that minority of people supporting.
It's a minority. It's a minority. Yeah. And I think it's really important to hold on to that it is not the majority of people saying that.
What are the dangers of painting, London as a no-go area for Jewish people? Because I equated it. I was discussing this with someone, and I equated it with during Black Lives Matter, for instance. There was that fringe of people who joined in that sort of painted everybody going marching in Black Lives Matter as being a looter or being dangerous or what have you. There is always that conflation. But what is, and that it wasn't safe for white people to be around a Black Lives Matter marches, where, there were lots of white people in the Black Lives Matter marches. But I'm interested in, when you call some area a no-go zone, go area or zone, what does that do to people? How does it make them feel? How does it exacerbate issues?
Well, I think it's a really important point, which is that there is also a psychological element of this, which is that the more you make the point that something is not safe, the less safe that people feel. And it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you say that London is a no-go zone, and people say, well, I'm not sure I should go into central London because I'm not sure it's safe for me. They don't go. And then after a few weeks of not going, they feel that they can't go anymore. And it almost is a gift to that minority of people who are trying to achieve that aim, which is that suddenly it becomes a no-go zone just by virtue of the discussion around it. And I think that this is the thing that we really need to push back on, which is that there has got to be a way, even for us as British citizens, and people that live in this country, which is by and large a very peaceful and democratic and tolerant country, to be able to sit down and have the muscle for difficult conversations. People have extremely different opinions, and they are vehemently different. But we have to be able to sit down and find a way to coexist and allow very different opinions to sit side by side and find a way for people to do that in a non-threatening way. There will be fringes where there is unacceptable discourse. But beyond those fringes, we've got to be able to tolerate difficult conversation. And I think what's happening today is that we're almost kind of destroying the muscle that exists for communities to engage in difficult dialogue with each other. And once that doesn't exist, you create massive polarization in society, where people are kind of almost siloed in Muslim communities and Jewish communities and Palestinian communities, unable to interact with each other. And that's incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous for life in the UK, but it's also profoundly unhelpful in terms of helping to think how, the international community, and the UK as an international player, can get round the table and be part of the solution. Because actually what happens is the government then just responds to the extremes on the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. And takes that as a vote. As norm. Let's talk about the rise of, anti-Semitism. Is it a rise, or is it fanning flames which were simmering there anyway? Has it given license to a lot of people who maybe kept their anti-Semitism subtle or under wraps? Has it given them license to be more overt about it? Or do you think there's genuinely more anti-Semitism, people who are new to the party, so to speak?
Well, look, I am not an expert on kind of anti-Semitism tracking the trends, but I think it's a mixture of both. So you have people for whom this is the perfect excuse, right? Which is that they don't particularly like Jews, or they don't really understand the community, for whatever reason they have a prejudice, and suddenly there's what they perceive to be a legitimate reason to air that in public, and actually it gets normalized, and it's not such a fringe thing to do anymore to make an anti-Semitic comment in public. So I think there's that. I think there is a real issue with conflation of religious communities, diaspora communities, with the actions of governments overseas. So this sense of, well, Jews are somehow responsible for what the Israeli government is doing. And I think it's the same with Muslims, that people look at Muslims and say, well, somehow you are responsible for Hamas, even though, that Muslims live all over the world, and Hamas is a tiny minority of people in a country that most Muslims in this country actually, are not from that part of the region either. And so there is this real conflation of religious minorities with what's happening on the ground over there. And people, are fundamentally, I think, unable to distinguish and look at things in a complex way. So you kind of say, well, Israel's a Jewish country. This Jewish country is doing things that I don't like, and therefore they are a legitimate target of my grievance. And so you end up with a massive conflation. And I think it's really hard for people sometimes to just understand where the line is, and what's legitimate criticism, what is anti-Semitic. Where should I direct my rage? And people feel rage by what they see on the news. Yeah. Who is the correct recipient of my rage? And some of it, I think, and I don't say this to diminish the reality of the fact that there is a spike in anti-Semitism. Some of it, I think, is just sometimes badly understood and misunderstood kind of politics, which is that I know that many Jews in the UK, travel to Israel, have friends and family in Israel, and therefore they are a legitimate recipient of my grievances. And it's people's unnuanced understanding or misunderstanding of what is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's the nuances. And so when people talk about no-go zones and what have you, it plays to all of the worst parts of, our worst fears, doesn't it?
Yeah, and to be honest with you, there are bad faith actors that also are using this conflict to sow division, and there always are. But I haven't witnessed it to the extent that we're seeing it in this conflict. And this is the worst. And I've been working on Israel-Palestine issues for over a decade. This is obviously the worst outbreak of violence in that period of time. So it's extreme. But the bad faith actors who look at this as an opportunity to sow division amongst different communities and pit them against each other, this is like a gift to them, which is that people are fearful for legitimate reasons, and you stoke fear and you turn it and you create a reality in which people then feel that they are not welcome or that they don't have a future here, and people look for sensation, as you said at the beginning of this, clickbait, which is that it's a really good headline that there's no-go zone for Jews, that there's no future for Jews in Britain. I mean, I can tell you as someone who leads a very Jewish life in quite a non-Jewish neighbourhood of London, that my experience, and this is very anecdotal, is that, I mix in pretty non-Jewish circles day to day in my neighbourhood, and I'm very publicly Jewish, and people are nothing other than interested, open, sympathetic. They know what I do for my job, and they ask really legitimate questions in a very thoughtful way. And that's not everybody's experience, but I think it is really important to push back against this idea that there is no space for kind of reasonable discussion about this stuff, because that's not true. It's not true. And the more we say it, the more true it becomes.
Yeah, and absolutely. And that's why I love speaking to you on this show, because I hope we open people's eyes to the nuances and give them the license to talk about these things in a respectful way. Hannah, love having you on the show. Thank you so much for that. That's Hannah Weisfeld, who's executive director and founder of Yachad there.